responsibility foundations to deliver food, medical equipment, and protective gears to vulnerable population and volunteers, soldiers on the front lines. His speech is Why Ukraine Matters.
On the morning of February 24th, 2022, a Ukrainian Marine combat engineer by the name of Vitaly Skakun was stationed in Kherson in southern Ukraine. His task? To slow the advance of Vladimir Putin's troops, who had just invaded his country that morning from the north, the east, and the south. His unit swiftly placed explosives on the Henichesk bridge that led into the city, where they soon realized that the Russians were much closer than they thought. Vitaly was the last one on the bridge, staring down the face of Putin's private mercenary army, when he realized that he wouldn't have time to retreat and remotely trigger the explosives. This combat engineer, this 25-year-old husband and father, made a heart-wrenching, incredible choice. He radioed his team, informed them of his decision, and manually detonated the bridge to slow the Russian advance, killing himself in the process. This Ukrainian hero, standing alone on a bridge, looking straight into the monster's eye, with his heroic actions, told the second largest army in the world, "This is Ukraine. You shall not pass." Vitaly Skakun is just one example in a massive sea of unbelievable Ukrainian heroism that has been taking place across the country of Ukraine over the last year. While Putin and his criminal mercenaries hit Ukraine with 60,000 shells per day, rape and murder civilians, loot and plunder their homes, and commit unspeakable acts of moral depravity on a massive scale, Ukrainians are humbly and matter-of-factly fighting back. While Putin targets schools and hospitals with his missiles, Ukrainians resist. While Putin's soldiers murder innocents and attach their explosive mines to children's toys and animals, the Ukrainian people are standing firm, alone, under the punishment of Atlas. They wipe their tears and rise again with each new day, 365 days in a row. Well, why does Ukraine matter to us? There are some who say this isn't our fight. They're not Americans after all. They're so far away. Let Europe handle them, or just leave them to the wolves. But I'm here to tell you that every single one of us has a reason to care and a moral obligation to help. Most of us here are already convinced by the humanitarian argument. There are innocents who are suffering, and that's all we need to know in order to help. But that argument doesn't sway everyone. So, to the pragmatists, the realists, the nationalists, and the isolationists who pride themselves on not budging for mere human suffering, I tell you this: the United States and every person in it should help Ukraine not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the smart thing to do. First, it would weaken us as a nation if we refused to help Ukraine. In 1994, we signed the Budapest Memorandum in which we promised to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine when it became one of only 4 countries in history to give up its nuclear arsenal for the safety of humanity. If we don't follow through on our national commitments, no one will ever trust us again. Red lines and threats will mean nothing, and this will lead us into more and greater conflicts. Second, those who care primarily for national security, you should know that military analysts and Pentagon officials have said that helping Ukraine is one of the best national security investments we can make as a country. We are essentially paying Ukraine pennies on the dollar to greatly weaken one of the biggest threats to global security, Putin's Russia. Third, economics. Russia's war against Ukraine has driven up oil and gas prices, created global shortages in food and other resources, and spiked inflation and economic uncertainty. So if you hate inflation and high gas prices, help Ukraine win this war. But by far, the most important reason to help Ukraine is, of course, because they deserve it. I can tell you about the men and women who stood in front of Russian tanks to slow their advance, or the amazing school teachers who stood and taught their classes in cold, damp, underground bomb shelters, refusing to let Putin destroy their students' education, or the grandmas who learned how to use an AK-47. I can tell you about the women and children who work day and night to hand-stitch camouflage netting for their brothers, fathers, and sons on the front lines. Or the food seller in Odessa who left a sign saying he went to volunteer with the Ukrainian army and that anyone who needed food could take his for free. I could tell you about the Ukrainian construction workers with good jobs in the Netherlands who apologized, left all their tools, and went back to fight for their country. We could talk about the women who endured the bombing of a maternity hospital in Mariupol and were still had the courage to bring life into this world. Or the 10-year-old checkers champion, a young girl named Valeria, who raised 21,000 Ukrainian hryvnias and donated the entire amount to her country's defenders. Or the Ukrainian surgeon who risked his life to remove an unexploded grenade from the chest cavity of a soldier and saved his life. I could also tell you about my friend, Maxime, who volunteered to fight for his country even though he had no fighting experience and had a young wife and child at home. On the 11th day of his deployment, he was hit by a Russian grenade and nearly died. And even though he lost 90% of his vision, he was still hoping to heal and come back to the front lines to defend his country. I could also tell you about the 77-year-old Asia Serpinska, who rescued hundreds of animals by herself from Russian shelling. I could tell you about the firefighters who worked day and night to extinguish the hateful flames of Putin's jealous and murderous rampage. I could tell you about the symphony director in occupied Kherson, who was shot dead for refusing to perform for the Russian occupiers. I could tell you about the Ukrainians with disabilities who gathered together in their wheelchairs and made Molotov cocktails to defend their country. Or the 11-year-old boy who came to a Ukrainian army recruiting center asking to be enlisted to help protect his country. Or the 17-year-old Ukrainian boy, Oleksandr Kharkushka, who saved the lives of 5 Ukrainian children when he saw them playing with a grenade, grabbed it from them, and covered it with his own body, receiving severe shrapnel wounds and losing 4 fingers in the process. I could tell you about ballet dancers, actors, tennis stars, and famous Ukrainian musicians who didn't use their fame to hide, but instead volunteered to fight and die for their people. But mostly today, I want to tell you about the indefatigable Marine, Mikhailo Diallo, a defender of the famous Azovstal steel plant, who returned from Russian captivity with 4 centimeters of bone missing from his arm. Incredibly, when he was released in a prisoner exchange, he emerged with a smile and a peace sign. As Brandon Sanderson from Utah might say, he smiled despite the grief he felt at the deaths of his men. He smiled because that was what he did. That's how he proved to Putin and to himself that he wasn't beaten. And when Mikhailo's fellow Ukrainians saw the photo of him smiling after his release, smiling in spite of his horrific wounds, they announced a donation drive on his behalf and raised more than $175,000 in the first 24 hours. But Mikhailo, incredibly, turned around and immediately donated the entire crowd-funded amount to the Ukrainian children whose fathers had died defending Mariupol. After that, a Ukrainian soccer team heard about his generosity and volunteered to pay for the surgery. Ukrainians refuse to give up. Ukrainians band together. Even though Russia has been trying to destroy Ukrainian identity for 300 years, since the time of the Tsars, through annexation, political manipulation, and artificial hunger famines killing millions of Ukrainians, Ukraine has given the world a masterclass in what it means to fight for freedom. And just as the world started to become less democratic, autocrats and dictators started to think that they were winning the global contest of political systems, Ukraine reminded the world that things like human dignity, freedom, and the right to exist cannot be taken for granted. They have united the free world. And yet today, 1 year after the invasion, Ukraine still desperately needs our help. The Russian Goliath might be missing a few toes, but he still stumbles forward, frenzied with bloodlust and bent on destruction, killing everything in his path. And yet, the Ukrainian David still stands against this Russian Goliath. David stands alone and undaunted on the battlefield. He is bloody, but unbowed. His sling has been constantly in motion since day one. but he is running out of rocks to throw. And like his leader told the world 1 year ago, he only needs ammunition from us, not a ride. He also doesn't expect us to fight for him. He is ready and willing to fight and die for his people, but he needs the tools to win. He will never forsake the innocents who huddle and shiver behind him, sheltering from the hateful Russian storm. Each Ukrainian David on the front lines knows that if he fails in his task, the horrors of Russia's criminal army will be unleashed on the innocent women and children behind him. And what we do next will decide their fate. Will we leave them to the wolves? Will we leave David alone on the battlefield with an empty sling?
No!
Martin Luther King Jr. said, "When evil men plot, good people must plan. When evil men burn and bomb, good men must build and bind. When evil men shout ugly words of hatred, good men must commit themselves to the glories of love." That is the task before us, and we must not fail. Thank you.